You for joining us for our midday devotional. Today is Thursday, if you can believe it. Already the week is half gone. Throughout the week, we have studied the topic of how do we readjust? How do we readapt once the COVID 19 virus, at least the crisis component of it, is lifted? Now, let me do a disclaimer up front. Many states, many jurisdictions, for political reasons, for economic reasons, you remember now, the United States is a capitalistic country. So, because of the power of the dollar, many places are saying the COVID 19 crisis has passed and life can return to normal. Well, that's the furthest thing in the world from the truth because the numbers in many, many areas are on the rise. The number of cases of verified COVID 19 is documented. So, although we are doing the lesson on how to readapt to a degree of normalcy, that does not mean that today or tomorrow you go out and start the adaptation or the readaptation process. At noon today, we will discuss in more detail how to facilitate moving a person out of a traumatic experience such as the COVID 19 virus, and also because of the escalated police violence that is coming to light. Those are all traumatizing events. So at noon, we will address how do we facilitate assisting people to move away from those crisis points in their lives. For right now, let's enjoy some devotional singing, and at noon, we will begin our lesson. Patiently waiting, Lord, for the night. I've got the Hebrew, living in one faith, the kind of faith to know that my blessing shall come and it's mine. Oh, mine. Oh, Lord, it's harvest. Oh, Lord, I've come to receive, to receive my patiently waiting. Oh, for the harvest and I don't think you believe I got that Hebrew. Now, mighty monotone, let's go stereo. And it's mine, all mine. It's harvest time. Oh, Lord, I've come to receive, patiently waiting for the harvest. I've got the Hebrew. Y'all so nice in here. It's mine. Oh, mine. It's harvest time. Well, I'm standing in your presence. I've been existing on your word. Everything, Lord, you promised to me, I know I'll receive. Oh, yeah. And if it's the Father's real good pleasure, that is whole kingdom is mine. Oh, that is mine. Oh, Lord, it's mine. Oh, Lord, come to receive, faith, my relationship, it's mine. Lord, I believe in Him. Great thing He promised me a long time ago. I know I'm gonna get it because the Bible tells me so. Now listen, my Father will pledge it. Just keep Brother Jim Wallace, come to receive my blessing. I'm patiently waiting. Brother Jim Wallace, for the harvest. Oh, I got the Hebrew, the living one. Oh, that kind of faith. My blessing shall. Oh, he's sweet, I know he's sweet, I know, 'cause you know the storm clouds may rise and strong, the winds may blow, but I hear the word wherever I go. I'm going to tell them that I'm finding a Savior, and He's free. Sing that with me, church. Sweet, I know, 'cause you know the song. Clouds will rise and strong winds they blow, but I tell the world wherever I'm going to tell them that I found the Savior, and He's sweet. Y'all hum this with me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Sometimes, storm clouds, and there they rise and roll. Winds they blow, I'm gonna tell the world, everybody wherever I go, I'm going to tell them that I done found me a Savior. I done found me a Savior. Y'all holler for me one more time. Trials are home. Every hand, we just don't understand all of the ways that God is gonna lead us here, down through this here, sin cursed, trouble filled land, but He's going to guide us with His eye, and we're gonna fall until we die. Gonna tell everybody that I done found me, I done got baptized into me a Savior. He is so sweet, He's so sweet, He is so sweet, He is so sweet that They told me to make sure you come free. Ain't it been good? He's listening, y'all say He sweet. You see, sometimes sickness comes and problems comes, and sometimes we just don't know what to do. You're strong winds they blow, but I can tell the world I'm going to tell them that I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and I found me a Savior there, and he said and it been good, y'all, and it been good, y'all said that come on, boy. He's sweet. You see, some of y'all got some kids and you just don't know what to do with them. And some of y'all having some problems. Some of y'all ain't got no job right now. Some of y'all, you just don't know what to do. You just don't know what to do. But one of these days, you're going to testify. You're going to testify. You're going to testify. Wherever you go, you're going to tell them on the job that I done got me. I done found me. I serve me a Savior. Well, and come on, y'all, sing it with me. Come on, y'all, sing it with me. Jesus is listening. Take his hand, and I want you to know my God's been good. He's sweet. You see, sometimes, it just don't seem right. I've been trying to do my best, and it still don't seem right. Sometimes that wind blows. I'm against this Christian frame I got, but I can testify. Wherever I go, I'm going to tell them that I done found me. I got me. I'm a member of the Church of Christ. Sweet, I know.
Indeed, Jesus is sweet because we know personally what he has done for each one of us. Over the past 3 days, we have addressed the topic of the readjustment once a trauma event or trauma events have passed. Most of you know that my background is twofold. As a clinical psychologist, I address things from a therapeutic approach using the most recent behavioral science available. And you also know that I am a Bible-centered person. My undergrad degree is in Bible. So when we combine the biblical component, meaning the Jesus component, the knowledge of the history of God's people, and how God has always shown grace and mercy and compassion and unconditional positive regard to his people, and we couple that with a working knowledge of learning more and more about how people think, which leads to how people behave, then we have a great combination of the behavioral sciences compounded with the Bible, God's directives for us in terms of how do we get from this sin-cursed earth back to heaven. When we deal with trauma, we're dealing with something that has impacted an event in our lives that has taken us away from thoughts of pleasure, feelings of pleasure, the anticipation of comfort, into a zone of uncertainty. Now, the greatest trauma that has ever happened in this world was the trauma that Adam and Eve experienced when they transgressed against God in the book of Genesis, chapter 3. And ever since that traumatic event, a portion of that trauma has trickled throughout the eons of time, and each of us, still as we grow, as we mature, we begin to embrace some of that traumatization. Regardless of how great our upbringings has been, regardless of how great the intents of our families are or were, somehow we still latch on to some of that historic trauma. And it interferes with our present opportunities for joy and comfort. Today I would like to address how our brain, as we talked about on yesterday, sometimes plays tricks on us. And the objective of readjusting to a degree of normalcy is to move the brain back to the pre-traumatic time. Not in a way that makes it eradicate the traumatic event, but in a way that says to the individual, whatever that trauma is in this in-between space, that is not where you spend all of your time. It's an episode that happened that disrupted the pleasure and the joy and the happiness. But the goal of readjustment or readaptation is to help people basically move through the trauma, the COVID-19, where it separated us from loved ones. It separated us from our work environments. It separated us from our regular daily routines. It separated many people permanently from family and friends because of death. And then you compound that traumatic experience with all of a sudden now it's coming more and more to light about how police brutality has traumatized the African American community, especially for almost 400 years of the existence of this country. As a matter of fact, you cannot separate police brutality from the formation of the United States of America. They are contemporaneous events that have run hand in hand. So, how do we help individuals get to a space that we can operate in a productive manner without feeling traumatized or the anticipation of being traumatized every waking moment of our lives? That's the objective of helping people move through and move back to an adjustment that they were once accustomed to in life. Now, the purpose of assisting in the desensitization or the readaptation or readjustment process is to help people resolve in that mental space those flashbacks and those nightmares or the constant fired up mind. Typically it's fired up 5 times more intensely because of trauma than before the trauma event happened. So picture this. If your mind was moving at 5 miles per hour, that's a brisk walk. Now it's moving at 25 miles an hour. And that's a sprint. That's an all-out sprint. Can you imagine your mind running at 25 miles per hour all day and all night? It sucks the very energy out of the body. You're tired, you're exhausted, but you can't slow down. That's why it becomes so important to help people move back to where they were before the trauma happened. Now, all trauma begins with a perceived threat. The COVID-19. If there were no perceived threats with the COVID-19, there would be no trauma. Well, you say, Dr. McClure, what were some of the threats? The threats of death, the threats of sickness, the threat of I'm not going to be able to work. My job has shut down. The threat of I won't be able to travel. I can't go across town. I can't go out of town. I can't go out of the country. The threat of economic just demise. If I can't work, then how am I going to pay my bills? I'm going to end up in bankruptcy. I'm going to lose my house. So trauma is a perceived threat. If we talk about the escalation of the awareness of police brutality, it's been going on for 400 years. But now the escalation of awareness. With that escalation of awareness comes the perception of threat. I'm 65 years old, and the threat is, as a 65-year-old African American man with credentials in psychology, credentials in ministry, membership to some prestigious professional organizations, but the perceived threat that at any moment I could be pulled over by a police officer who has no idea about any of their credentials. They have no idea about my status in the community. They have no idea about my family, about what my sons do, what my daughter-in-laws do, what my wife does. There is a degree of trauma that's built into the perception of what could happen to us as a race of people. So the objective is to help individuals move back into a space to where we're not always on high alert. And in order to do that, it requires a skill set. Let me talk to you about what is called the cognitive behavioral therapy. But I want to tell you up front, it's not the technical parts of the cognitive behavioral therapy that heals the trauma. The cognition, the mind, the processes of the mind and how it behaves based on what has impacted it, that's the cognitive behavior. How has the behaviors of COVID-19 or the police impacted how we think? Now, I want you to think with me. We have about 5-6 minutes left in the lesson presentation today. There are 4 components, basically, to cognitive behavioral therapy. The psychoeducational part, the anxiety management component, the exposure to the trauma itself, and then what we call cognitive restructuring. Those are the 4 technical components. But let me share something with you. The critical factor that makes the difference in the post-traumatic stress treatment or the traumatic brain injury treatment, and you can't talk about PTSD without talking about TBI, because in order for there to be a trauma impact, there had to be some type impact on the brain. So whether you want to call it TBI or whether you want to call it PTSD, the critical factor that really makes a difference is the therapeutic relationship. Now, that therapeutic relationship is not found in the psychoeducational component, nor is it found in the anxiety management component, nor is it found in the exposure component, nor is it found really in the cognitive restructuring component by itself. Do you know where you find the real therapeutic relational component? It's from the individual that is helping the person process through the trauma. I want to share with you some biblical concepts of what I'm sharing with you, and you'll get this real simple. It's really simple. This is why I introduced to you at the onset my biblical background. And this is why I introduced at the onset my clinical background. Because if I don't approach this with the model of Jesus, the Spirit of the Lord, then the likelihood of helping you or anybody else adapt to what was normal is going to be minimal. In the book of John, chapter 10, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, beginning at verse number 10, listen at what Jesus says. He says, the thief comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. The thief is the traumatizing event. The COVID-19 virus didn't come to do you any good. It came to harm in whatever ways it has harmed. And it has harmed all of us differently. As many of you as might be tuned in today, whether it's through Facebook, whether it's at the YouTube channel, or whether it's at the church's website. But the COVID-19 virus did not come to bless you. It came to harm you. It came to steal some joy. It came to steal some opportunities. It has stolen or taken some of our family members. It has taken some of our loved ones, some of our friends. It has caused some of us to end up in financial distress. It has caused some of us to have anxiety in heart. Jesus says the thief, whatever that traumatizing thief is, it only comes to steal, to kill, to destroy, to rob you of your joy. But he says, but I come that you might have life, and that more abundantly. Do you see the soothing of the helper, Jesus? He says, I know what's happened to you. You know what has happened to you. But here's why I come. I come to help life become better for you. Do you see the helper? The helper has to engage the person who's been traumatized. And the helper has to be the voice of hope for the person who's been traumatized. It is very, very important if we're going to help people readjust, readapt back to a space of normalcy. It's imperative that the helper understands how to help. We can't come in and escalate the anxieties of people. They're already escalated 5 times greater than they were before the traumatizing event. So you don't come in saying, well, you better be glad you're not dead because of the COVID-19. Look at all of the people who died. You can't come in saying, well, you ought to be thankful that you're living. So why are you worried about you losing your... You can't approach people like that. Because Jesus says that's what that's what the traumatic event did. We can't approach people like the police approach people. The police approach people in a traumatizing, screaming, yelling, intimidating manner. Jesus says we cannot approach people like the thief. In the Gospel of John, again, chapter 14, verse 1 and verse 27. Listen at how Jesus approached people who had been traumatized by the world, traumatized by religion, traumatized by the politics of the day. Jesus says, let not your heart be troubled any longer. Let not your heart be troubled. Trauma troubles the spirit. If it didn't trouble the spirit, you couldn't have trauma. Jesus knew that. So he approaches people whose spirits have been turned upside down. And in John 14, verse 1, and again in verse 27, Jesus says, and let not your hearts be troubled. Wouldn't that help you? Have you ever gone to a doctor and the doctor says, well, I've read your charts and you're just a mess? Does that raise your anxiety? Or does it lower it? You better believe it raises it. But what if the physician walked in and said, "Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. I've read your charts, and I'm here to help process and to help you make sense of what we've discovered. But I want you to know that I'm not here to raise your anxiety. Uh, I'm here for us to work through this, and I'm here to support you. So don't panic because we're going to work through this together." Which approach would you prefer? Yeah, I thought so. See, when people have been traumatized, the role of the helper and the approach of the helper really drives the therapeutic process. Let me give you another Bible illustration of how Jesus helped people readjust. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 28, 29, and 30, Jesus gives an invitation. Come unto me, all of you that have been broken, that are dealing with trauma, that are heavy laden. Come to me. Cast all of your trauma onto me, and I'll give you rest. I'm meek, and I'm lowly in spirit. My yoke is easy. It's easier than the trauma, and my burden is light. Trauma makes a heavy load. Jesus says, I'm not here to add to your burden. I'm not here to add to your load. I'm here to make life better. Do you see the role of the therapeutic helper in the process of educating a person, of managing anxiety, of helping them make sense of what they've been exposed to, and of helping them to restructure that? As children of God, if we're going to help people readjust, then we must learn the modeling of Jesus. We can't come at people in an intimidating way. We can't come at people in an all authoritative way. What we will look at tomorrow is how Jesus, with his therapeutic approach, would allow people to participate in their own healing. But once they saw that Jesus was on their side, and that Jesus would approach them with mercy and compassion and grace and love and not judgmental, that's when they were able to kind of slow down and listen and talk and process and decide, you know what? I think life is going to be okay. And that's the objective in helping individuals readjust, readapt to a degree of normalcy once we get through this COVID-19 and once we process through the police brutality. I hope that the lesson today in some way has been beneficial. With the events that are going on a day-by-day basis, we still need prayer. And I'm going to ask you to join me in prayer at this time. Father, we thank you for the model of Jesus, how he came to us meek and lowly, but yet as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We're thankful, Father, that Jesus was able to be touched in all of the areas that we struggle with, and that he can be moved with compassion and join us and comfort us and communicate with us in a way that gives us confidence in him and his healing powers. I pray, Father, for this country, that you will assist each one of us through this power of your Holy Spirit to learn from the perfect Lord how we can be agents of change in this imperfect world. I pray that you will watch over the politicians of this world who are screaming and speaking in a way that is only escalating the trauma. I pray, Father, for those in policing positions who are operating in such a way that they too are escalating the trauma. And Father, I pray for the very citizenry of this country, black and white, who are speaking across each other in a way that continues to escalate the trauma. Help us, Father, to speak truth, but speak it in love. Help us, Father, to give hope to a world that is filled with trauma. And I pray, Father, that as we, as the agents of change, operate in a manner that is more similar to that of Jesus, that indeed the traumatic speed of this world will slow down, and we will be able to walk in a spirit of peace, a spirit of love, and a spirit of hope. We love you because you first loved us. Through Jesus I pray. Amen. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I invite you to please join us again tomorrow on Friday as we continue this series on trauma. God bless you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Yes, I'm learning to live. Learning to live. Yes, I'm learning to live on Jesus. Every day I'm finding more power than I ever dreamed. Yes, I'm learning to live on Jesus. Yes, I'm learning to live. Yes, I'm learning to live. Every day I'm learning to live on Jesus. Finding more power than I ever dreamed. Yes, I'm learning to live on Jesus. Sad, broken hearted at an altar I knelt. I found peace, so serene. I know that he has God is a childlike trust, and a heart that's pure and clean. Yes, I need to live every day. I need to live times of sickness, when I'm alone and in despair, I call on Jesus, and He's always there. Oh, yes, He is. You know He'll never leave me. He won't forsake me. He'll be there. He'll be there. He'll be there. He'll be there. Anytime.